No more war. We do not accept that in any circumstances, for any reason, there should be war. We have nailed it to the pillory as a dreadful crime committed between people. In 1938, all of Europe proclaimed that war was a crime. But here, in Germany, one man, Adolf Hitler, and one party, the Nazi Party, wanted war. They decided to tear up the Treaty of Versailles and to remake the map of Europe by force. Since 1936, Hitler has reoccupied the Rhineland, annexed Austria, and crushed the Sudetenland. He must be stopped, but no one dares. Paris. In the summer of 1938, Edouard Daladier, President of the French Council, returns from Munich, where he is given in once more to Hitler. In spite of existing treaties, France and England have abandoned Czechoslovakia. She will soon be carved up. Meanwhile, Daladier is wildly acclaimed. France has just broken her word. That doesn't matter, as long as peace is assured.
I am certain now, thanks to the wish for mutual concessions and to the spirit of collaboration which has strongly animated the action of the heads of government of the four great Western powers, that the peace is safe today.
France, worn out, divided, and obsessed by the memory of the slaughters of the First World War, heaves a sigh of relief. The French right, traumatized by the Popular Front and by the Spanish War, is obsessed with communism and cherishes a secret admiration for Hitler and Mussolini, strong men who know how to maintain order in their countries. And the left? Are they going to fan the flame of patriotism against fascism? August the 23rd, 1939. Von Ribbentrop, the German foreign minister, flies to Moscow. He's going to sign a non-aggression pact with Soviet Russia. The French left is stunned. How can this be possible? Hitler wants a free hand in the East because he intends to attack Poland. He knows this will mean war with England and France, but he doesn't want to fight on two fronts simultaneously. Stalin, faced with the delaying tactics of the Western democracies, has done an about turn. He wants to gain time. Summer 1939. This is the third summer that paid holidays are given to French workers. The French are only beginning to enjoy the benefits of the Popular Front. September the 1st. At dawn, without declaring war, the German troops go into Poland. An irresistible force, 63 divisions, of which 6 are armored, supported by 2,000 planes. Faced with this, the Poles can only field 12 cavalry brigades and 300 planes. In spite of their legendary bravery, what can the Polish lancers do against the German armor? In London and Paris, there are anguished consultations about the invasion of Poland. This time, there must be no drawing back. Paris and London send Hitler an ultimatum. If hostilities have not ceased before midday on September the 3rd, it is war. In Paris, Edouard Daladier doesn't dare to submit this decision openly to Parliament. He simply asks them to vote him exceptional military authority. In the French Assembly, the word war will not even be mentioned in the course of this debate, in which Deputy Louis Jacquinot took part.
I have to say that the Assembly wasn't unanimous. One must recognize that. And then there was a history of ambiguity, because the declaration of war was made under the guise of a vote for military authority. Daladier must be blamed for this method of presenting the declaration of war, as I told you. The truth is that negotiations were continuing, and I have the impression, in contrast to the British, that there was a hope all the same that the war wouldn't happen, or at least that the Germans wouldn't attack France.
What was the atmosphere like here?
Very disturbed. There really wasn't the enthusiasm of the First War. I was young in 1914. There was, without doubt, national unity, at least in the Assembly. The Assembly was unanimous. There wasn't, first of all, the eagerness. One must say the country, after draining itself, as it did in 1914, didn't want to experience a second war. There was still a feeling that it wasn't right to excite the heart and not to show enthusiasm for a fight.
France goes into the war, but holding back all the way.
We will make war because it is thrust upon us. Each one of us is at his post on the frontiers of France. In this land of liberty, where respect for human dignity has one of its last refuges, you must combine all your efforts with a deep feeling of concord and fraternity for the welfare of the country. Long live France. Vive la France.
More than half those who went to fight had already fought in the First World War. André Arquin, commander of the 34th Infantry Regiment. Monsieur Arquin, this plaque brings back memories to you, doesn't it?
Yes, it brings back great memories. I found myself there on August 25th, 1914, mobilized in my turn, and in 1939 there I was again at the same place on the platform. The faces weren't the same, though. In 1914, they had an enthusiasm, they had something, it was exciting. Whereas in 1939, people were thoughtful. They thought of all the things they had left, because to make war again within 20 years is hard.
Truly, 2 wars in 1 generation is too much, and France is not prepared for war. Some say it's the fault of the workers' strike and the Popular Front. Anyway, Hitler hasn't attacked France, say others. Defend our own country, yes, but who wants to die for Danzig, for Poland? Certainly, everyone will do their bit if necessary, but the heart's not in it. Not really. Daladier greets the British minister, Sir Anthony Eden, who represents the British cabinet and the countries of the Empire.
aux représentants des dominions de l'Empire britannique.
He's welcomed as a friend and a powerful ally. The government tries to reassure the French people by every means. But the pompous phrases of the propaganda written by the celebrated writer Jean Giraudoux ring terribly false.
Soldats de France.
Soldiers of France, our own young men, go bravely once more to make history with love for the defense of honor and liberty. Our brave and good people who, in so many of your quiet family groups, assemble already with the memories and apprehensions of 3 wars. Look with confidence at our allies, these young English soldiers, at their equipment, their magnificent equipment.
Courage, said the propaganda. Life goes on as before.
Confiance encore.
Be still confident. Always show confidence. Total confidence. Believe that everything is entirely in order and all goes well. The vineyard workers, since the beginning of this season, have been harvesting throughout France, as one sees here in Champagne and in Alsace. They are the young soldiers who will be forming the French army. They will assure the security of the frontiers. When the Franco-British brothers in arms return to us to sample the pleasure of drinking and laughter with us, these wines, with a wartime date, will be more delectable than ever, particularly the famous Alsace crop, the border wine.
During this time, Hitler crushes Poland. In 6 days, the German advance columns reach Warsaw. On September the 20th, the city is completely surrounded. The 30 divisions of the Polish army have been totally defeated, powerless in the face of the German armored force. But Warsaw, the first martyred town, resists for a week, in spite of daily bombardments by the Luftwaffe. By October the 1st, it's all over. German troops enter Warsaw. This is the first demonstration of the Blitzkrieg, lightning warfare. It's a complete success. Hitler can be triumphant. On September the 17th, Soviet troops also go into Poland. Stalin doesn't want to let Hitler come too close to his frontiers. And Europe witnesses an unforeseen spectacle. Russians and Germans fraternize around a tract in Russian, which proclaims, "The German army salutes the Red Army of workers and peasants, for whom it has always had great respect." Poland no longer exists. Before leaving, Hitler has entrusted this new protectorate of the German Reich to a Governor General, Police Chief Hans Frank of the SS. And he gives him a mission: settle the Jewish problem. In the West, Hitler has left 30 divisions, stretched along 530 miles of front. Against them, France has been able to concentrate 85 divisions, a unique opportunity to attack. On September the 5th, Operation Tsar is launched with a great show of publicity. But only 10 divisions advance cautiously on a 12-mile front, going into Germany through the Vannes forest. They take 15 days to penetrate 5 miles into German territory without meeting any resistance. The Germans have suffered enormous losses, announced the communiques proudly. In fact, they have less than 200 dead. The truth is that the French commander-in-chief, General Gamelin, doesn't believe in an offensive. After the fall of Warsaw on October the 1st, he orders a withdrawal, at night and in secret. At the time, General Beaufret was a captain at Army headquarters.
I must say that, in fact, it is Gamelin and Gamelin alone who carries the responsibility for that farce which was the so-called offensive on the Saar front.
The French army could have made a big offensive.
Not only could have, but should have, for reasons of morale. but they just made a half-hearted attempt. If one had made a push at that moment, we would have had almost nothing in front of us. Perhaps certain inadequacies in command would have been shown. One would have had to replace some generals, as they did in 1914. It would have given the army a lift and a capacity that it wasn't able to get back later.
It was a lost chance.
It was a completely lost chance. Much more so at that time when the Siegfried Line wasn't even finished. It was the incompetence of Gamelin, who was a person who was entirely, if you like, unprepared to make a decision.
It wasn't only Gamelin. I imagine the government didn't want this offensive either.
Well, as to the government, there was a very curious situation which developed during the winter when I was at Army headquarters in Paris. It was the position of Daladier. Daladier, who was a veteran of the First World War and quite brilliant as well, he had remembered the many casualties of 1914, etc., etc., and he had a motto which was, one must economize on French blood. In consideration of which, I was charged, personally, by the Army General Staff, to put on foot 7 divisions, which, if I remember rightly, were 3 foreign divisions and 3 Senegalese divisions. That was economizing on French blood, wasn't it?
C'est ça l'économie de sang français.
After the invasion of Poland, France expects a German offensive. Edouard Daladier, doubling as Prime Minister and Minister for War, inspects the defenses. He has again brought out his gaiters and his leather coat from World War I. The German attack is awaited, well back behind the Maginot Line. The Maginot Line, an idea dating from 1929. A line of uninterrupted fortifications, 300 miles long, which runs from Switzerland to Luxembourg. There's only one problem. It can't be extended along the Belgian frontier, because King Leopold wants to safeguard the neutrality of his country. And if the Germans attack through there, it doesn't matter. Marshal Pétain had replied in 1935, we will corner them like rabbits in the Ardennes. The Maginot Line, insurmountable. It took 6 years to build, 1.5 million square yards of reinforced concrete, 150,000 tons of steel. On the surface, one can see almost nothing, because the defense work is below ground, where there are miles of tunnels. Here, 500,000 men lived 120 feet below, like moles. Commander Ganglov spent 9 months of the war here.
Eh bien, la vie sous terre, évidemment.
Well, life underground is quite hard. It's quite hard because, obviously, in peacetime, there is boredom and inactivity. And from time to time, the soldiers grumble. They suffer from what's called the concrete bug.
On souffrait, c'est ce qu'on a appelé la bétonite.
The Maginot mentality became a factor that was to prove fatal to French morale. While it gave a feeling of invulnerability, there still remained the hope that the Germans would not put it to the test. The Maginot Line. It isn't only an armor plating of concrete and steel. It has become a mystic symbol. To doubt it is to doubt France. Hitler, encouraged by his success in Poland, wants to attack in the West at once. Returning from Warsaw, he summons the commander-in-chief of the army. He orders 50 divisions to be brought back immediately from Poland. A plan of campaign in the West is to be prepared by October the 20th. The German generals are completely opposed to this. It's madness, they say to each other. France isn't Poland. They also remember the First World War. For 2 weeks, they try to convince Hitler. The Polish campaign has revealed serious weaknesses, a lack of preparation. Hitler is furious and proclaims, "It is I who decide. I don't retreat in front of anything. I win or I fall." There is a breach between him and his general staff. Certain officers seriously consider overthrowing him with a coup d'etat. And on November the 8th, Hitler narrowly escapes an assassination attempt in the famous beer hall of the Bergenbraukeller in Munich, where he was celebrating the anniversary of the 1923 putsch. Is it the signal? No. While Hitler buries the victims, the Gestapo hunt the instigators throughout Germany, and the officers who have plotted the assassination abandon their plan. Hitler is still the master. Along the Siegfried Line, the German army gets the order to attack in the West on November the 12th, 1939. But on the 12th of November, weather conditions are unfavorable. The order is rescinded. 5 times in 2 months, Hitler issues the same order, but each time he is obliged to countermand it because of bad weather. So, like the French army, the German army digs itself into the Siegfried Line. The 2 armies are from now on face to face, on foot. It's the beginning of the phony war. The summer of 1939 is over. Winter is coming, and still nothing happens. People begin to hope that the war will end before it has really started. The stalemate continues for months. 5 million Frenchmen, called up to fight, are involved in this phony war, a war of waiting. During this time, the newsreels tried to keep up the morale of a country that was unprepared for war. This one shows French soldiers receiving 2,000 soccer balls that had been donated by an Englishman. The French people saw the soldiers gather to watch films in bomb shelters or to see shows in homes that had been offered for these events.
Partout, le cinéma de l'armée apporte sa distraction.
The entertainers of the time went up to the front to sing and dance with the troops. The songs and music contained an element of hope. Hope that the war that everyone was waiting for would never happen.
Le colonel était de l'action française. Le commandant était un modéré. Le capitaine était pour le diocèse. Et le lieutenant, le tête du curé. Le chuteux était un fervent extrémiste. Le sergent, un socialiste. Convaincu, le caporal, inscrit sur toutes les listes. Et 2e classe au PMU. Et tout ça, d'excellents Français, d'excellents soldats qui marchent au pas en pensant que la République c'est encore le meilleur régime ici-bas. Et tous ces gaillards qui pour la plupart n'étaient pas du même avis en politique lève-la tous 5 ans, quel que soit leur sort. Ils désirent tous désormais qu'on nous foute une bonne fois la paix.
In this climate, the war went on. In Germany, Goebbels' propaganda ministry launches a new kind of war, psychological warfare. Over Radio Stuttgart, the French traitor Verdun repeats his favorite slogan. French soldier, you're fighting for Britain. And announces the movements of the French frontline units before they even receive the orders themselves.
On vous a trahi. Vous battez pour l'impérialisme britannique.
How can the Germans be so well informed? The fifth column, of course. Keep quiet. Be suspicious. The ears of the enemy are listening. So spy fever is born, and hatred of the fifth column grows. German agents find French pro-fascists to help them. And the bombardments? They won't be long delayed. A passive defense must be organized to protect Notre Dame, the Arc de Triomphe, and the Opera. The treasures from the Louvre must be evacuated to the Chateau of the Loire. And the gas, as in 1918, it will be terrible. But after a few weeks, the excitement is over, and the gas mask has simply become a fashionable accessory. Yes, it's truly a phony war. Obsolete French planes fly dangerous missions over Germany, not to bomb, to drop leaflets, an assault of naive and pompous propaganda.
Une attaque aérienne avec 100 tonnes d'explosifs.
The newsreels maintain that leaflets are more effective than bombs. The Allies believe they can win the war by revealing the truth to the German people, rather than bombing them.
Les vérités que ses gouvernants lui cachent. Les alliés pénétrés de la sincérité de la cause qu'ils défendent obtiendront la victoire autant par la vérité que par les armes.
Winter has come. In the east, still nothing happens. It's one of the coldest winters that France has known for a long time. At the front, the temperature continues to drop. The waiting goes on. Christmas arrives, the first Christmas of war. Along the Maginot Line, the soldiers wonder if there will be others. In London, the end of the year is greeted joyfully . In 1940, France takes hope again. Time is working for us, it's said on all sides. In fact, the factories work at full capacity. Tanks leave the assembly plant at the rate of 300 a month. France begins to catch up in the armaments race. She's buying more and more planes from America, 200 already. Maybe the government is waiting for the Americans to come and fight with France. President Roosevelt would certainly like to. He knows that sooner or later America will have to come into the war. But his country is divided. Lindbergh, the hero who had been first to fly the Atlantic solo, doesn't hide his admiration for Hitler, and he campaigns against intervention in Europe. He has brought back successfully the slogan, America First. Even the United States ambassador in London, a certain Joseph Kennedy, another admirer of Hitler, preaches isolationism, while his 20-year-old son, John Kennedy, defends democracy. French factories are now producing modern aircraft. 350 in March, 550 in April. $1,600 planes in 5 months. But what can rival the Messerschmitt? March 1940. France has a change of government. Parliament has lost confidence in Daladier. Paul Reynaud replaces him. He's an Anglophile and in favor of an offensive. He has been properly elected by the vote of the majority, but he's obliged to retain Daladier as war minister. The propaganda changes its tone. We shall win because we are stronger, the posters proclaim now, showing the immense French and British empires. And it's true, on paper.
Undoubtedly, we had a certain self-confidence. I'd like to make it clear that the French army was considered a thing of importance, solid, dependable, etc. But at the same time, we were conscious of a great many weaknesses in the French army. One was very deeply conscious, for example, particularly my generation, that the French army was a great pillar of an outmoded party. For example, the developments in aviation, the developments in tanks, hadn't been adopted sufficiently by the French army, and therefore we had serious deficiencies.
The French army had not kept pace with the ideas that had been adopted in Germany. The tactics and strategies of the French High Command were those left over from the First World War. New ideas had been ignored. An almost unknown French colonel, who had written books which hardly anyone had read, proposed a plan as early as 1936, a war of movement with armored divisions supported by fighter planes. He is 50 years old and commands the 507th Tank Regiment. His name is Charles de Gaulle. On January the 26th, 1940, he addresses a memo to 80 French personalities. He wrote, "The present conflict will sooner or later be settled by surprise tactics, raids and pursuits in which volume and speed will infinitely exceed even the most vivid events of the past. In the present conflict, to stand still is to be beaten." From the time he takes over the government, Paul Reynaud, who has known since 1936 about Colonel de Gaulle's ideas, demands that the Allies take the initiative. Mr. Chamberlain, the British Prime Minister, is reluctant at first, but Mr. Churchill, First Sea Lord, is enthusiastic. During a meeting of the Supreme Council in London, the Allies decide to attempt an operation in Scandinavia in an effort to cut off the steel supply of the Germans. At the beginning of April, the Allies lay mines around the entrance to Norwegian ports, send an ultimatum to Norway and Sweden, and prepare several landings along the coastline. But Hitler accelerates his advance. He takes 4 hours to occupy Denmark and invades Norway. A new demonstration of lightning warfare. On April the 9th, 6 German divisions make a surprise landing. The Norwegians haven't had time to mobilize and attempt vainly to defend themselves, but they're crushed by the Luftwaffe. The Germans have air supremacy at all times. In 48 hours, they have occupied practically the entire country. In Oslo, Quisling, the Norwegian Nazi, has taken power. The king takes refuge in the north, then in London. For Hitler, it's another victory of staggering proportions. 8 days later, the Allies invade and the British land in the middle of Norway. They won't get far. They have to re-embark at the end of a week. For in Norway, the invincible Royal Navy makes a bitter discovery. Supremacy at sea is nothing without supremacy in the air. The Luftwaffe has sunk one of the few British aircraft carriers, the Courageous. Only a month later, the end of the whole campaign takes place outside Narvik in Norway, with the French Expeditionary Force commanded by General Betua. In the glimmer of the polar night, the 13th Brigade of the Foreign Legion, a battalion of Alpine troops, and 2 Polish battalions succeed in landing. After 10 days of hard fighting, the French finally take the town. It's the first Allied victory of the war, a victory won on land by General Betua, and which succeeded in stopping the steel supply to the Germans. But not for long, for only 24 hours in fact. The next day, the Expeditionary Force is recalled urgently to France. There the real war has begun. Saturday, May the 10th, at dawn, the German paratroopers of the 7th Division, under General Student, board the Junkers 52s. Objective, Holland. This time, Hitler stakes everything. He throws the entire German war machine against the West. 80 divisions, 3 times as many as in 1914. Along a 120-mile front, led by armored divisions, the Army Group B of General von Bock attacks Belgium and Holland, both neutral countries. On the morning of May the 10th, the 9th Panzer Division clears the Dutch frontier and rendezvous with the paratroops at Rotterdam. For the first time in history, the enemy falls from the skies. No one has ever seen this before. Student's paratroop mission is to take the airports and the bridges around Rotterdam. By late morning, he is able to announce to headquarters, mission accomplished. The next day, May the 11th, the armoured troops rendezvous with the paratroops, and the road to Rotterdam is open. For the Dutch, the situation is desperate. Queen Wilhelmina and her government leave for London. On the 14th, Rotterdam surrenders. But too late. Goering bombers are already on the way. After Warsaw, Rotterdam, the second shattered city, with 1,000 dead, 25,000 buildings burnt out, and 8,000 civilians made homeless. The whole world is shocked and indignant. Holland has been overrun in 4 days. At the same time as they are attacking Holland, the Germans invade Belgium in the direction of Liège. Belgium, so jealous of her neutrality that at one time she had brought her troops up against France. Faced with the might of Germany, she depends on the fortified line of the Albert Canal, of which the principal fortification is Eben-Emael, reputed to be impregnable. For the Germans, it's essential to take Eben-Emael. They use a new trick. Gliders drop 300 shock troops who cross the Albert Canal before the Belgians have had time to react and proceed to attack the fort. They know what they have to do. For weeks they practiced the operation on a mock-up in Germany. The Belgian 7th Infantry Division, who hold the fort, resist for 24 hours. But having obtained reinforcements, the shock troops make another assault. At midday, a trained acrobat climbs onto the roof and drops explosive charges inside the main casement. That's the end of Eben-Emael. After crossing the Albert Canal, the German armored divisions push on towards Liège and Namur. Everything is clear to the French General Staff. The Germans are again trying the 1914 maneuver, the famous Schleifen plan. Attack Belgium and carry on towards the Somme and Paris. The counter has been decided for a long time. General Gamelin orders the Allied armies in the north to throw themselves into the path of the enemy. Between Liège and Namur, at Gembloux and Louvain, they succeed at first in stopping the German advance. But Hitler has only invaded Holland and Belgium to divert the Allies. He wants to attack at Sedan, through the Ardennes, between the Maginot Line in the south and the Allied armies now heading north. The plan was developed by General von Manstein and is called the sickle blow. The objective is to head towards the English Channel and surround the Allied forces in Belgium. Three German armored divisions, the 19th Panzer Corps, lead the advance through the Ardennes. They're the crack troops. The best forces in the German army have been held back to take part in this offensive. Among them was Lieutenant Clemens von Kaganack.
After the victory in Poland, in 3 weeks, we had a feeling of superiority.
And you thought you could overcome the French army in the same way?
No, not at all. Just before the 10th of May,
chacun de nous, je crois, avait
Each one of us, I believe, thought it would be a very tough adventure.
très dur. L'armée allemande
The German army had a great respect for the French army. Through the hard experiences of the First World War,
de la Première Guerre, et ce respect n'existait pas en
and this respect wasn't only in the ranks, but also at headquarters.
les hauts milieux de l'état-major.
To lead the attack, the General Staff chooses General Guderian, a man of the new school, a tank specialist. In 1936, he read the works of General de Gaulle with approval. Guderian has an unshakable faith in his armored troops.
We knew that such a difficult enterprise would not be able to be won and exploited if the command and the troops weren't fully prepared. We were sure of victory when we began to march to the frontier on May the 9th.
No one was waiting for them there. The massive wooded area of the Ardennes, an impossible obstacle for tanks, everyone said. Not for Guderian's armor. He orders them to advance, day and night, without stopping, to exploit the surprise and the confusion of the enemy. They cross Luxembourg in 3 hours, the Belgian Ardennes in 1 day. They're resisted by the 9th Army of General Corrupt, but on May the 12th, they're already on the River Meuse. They have covered 80 miles in 48 hours. On the Meuse, several French units of General Hunziger's Second Army resist courageously amidst panic and disorder. They even manage to halt the Germans for a time. But not for long. Each time the Stukas fly over, the French have more trouble holding their position. On May the 13th, the Germans take the Meuse. The great German army gains its first foothold on the other side of the river. Guderian himself comes up to supervise the operation. By May the 15th, the battle is over. The French front is broken, and they are pushed back to Sedan. The first move in the Battle of France has been made. The Germans are close to total victory.
The battle you have just seen was one of the decisive battles of the Second World War, a war that affected the destinies of men and nations the world over. The film you have just witnessed was discovered in film libraries all over the world and painstakingly edited to show you the incredible impact these individual battles had on the outcome of this most devastating of wars. The world, thanks to these films, will never forget the tremendous effort put forth by all people included in the big battles.
On May the 14th, 1940, the German army is continuing its advance through Sedan in an effort to cut off and surround the Allied armies in Belgium. The French General Staff, realizing they have been outmaneuvered, counterattack with one of the few armored divisions in the French army. It is a last desperate attempt to halt the German tanks of General Guderian. Stretched out, over 12 miles, it's massacred, company by company. Between the 16th and 19th of May, another armoured division, the 4th, is hurriedly assembled and with Colonel de Gaulle in command, is thrown into the battle at Montcornet. For 24 hours, Guderian's armour is held in check. But once again, the Stukas appear in the clear blue sky. The Stukas, with their terrifying sirens. The French counterattack has advanced 1 mile towards Guderian's command post, but the Stukas stop them dead in their tracks. In spite of the odds, they fight valiantly. Also, they have discovered that in a battle of tank versus tank, the French armour is superior to the German. But they had neither anti-aircraft weapons nor air cover. Inevitably, they are defeated. Guderian and his tanks break through. Then General von Kleist orders him to stop and wait for the rest of the army. He ignores the order. Alone, he pushes on towards the Channel. General Beaufray was a captain on the French General Staff at the time.
Un officier d'état-major.
A general staff officer who was running a shuttle service between the groups of the army in the north had passed by as the German advance guard was going forward, and he had watched from behind the hedge. He reckoned there were only 10 motorcyclists and an armored car, a small advance guard.
François rien, quoi, une petite avant-garde. Et que, à mesure que...
This advance guard was going forward, and some of the defenders shouted, "Here come the Germans, here come the Germans, the Germans!" And everyone ran out of camp. This was the equivalent of what we had seen in earlier years. Here come the Russians, and here come the Cossacks. There was a sort of panic which preceded the arrival of the Germans, which meant that in reality there was no resistance between Sedan and the sea.
On the French coast, there is total confusion with the arrival of the Germans. The units, cut off from headquarters, are dislocated. Refugees from Belgium and northern France crowd the roads with their meager belongings. The regiments circle aimlessly. Where can they go next? The Germans are everywhere, in front and behind, north and south.
Nous avions le supplice de la goutte d'eau, nous recevions.
We were given a sort of water torture. We received bad news, bad news, bad news, unceasing bad news, without having the least success. If only the staff officers at General Georges' headquarters, who took notes to report, and had finished by becoming a little, how can I say, impressed by this atmosphere. Instead, they sneered and said to each other, "Oh yes, you are pushed back. Good, I'll make a note of it." It was an incredible atmosphere. This sort of moral wear and tear, which was produced by the accumulation of 8 days of constantly bad news, had in some ways worn away, worn to the bone, the capacity for reaction.
Helplessly, the French generals watched the collapse of their defense plans.
Le 18, peut-être le 17.
Perhaps the 18th or the 19th, General Dumont said to me, "This can't go on. I'm going to look for Gamelin." Because General Gamelin, the French commander-in-chief, wasn't near the front. He was at Vincennes, rear headquarters. Dumont left in a car to look for Gamelin, whom he regarded as a professional soldier, if one can say that. And then he spoke with him in the car, saying, "General, orders must be given. We can't stay down there." Then Gamelin came down, very dignified, with his little pot belly, and in that same room at Verdun, he said, "Well, I will give you an order." This order began with an extraordinary sentence, which was, "Without wishing to become involved in the conduct of the battle, it is acknowledged that special orders must be given to take account of the movement involving our left wing." In consequence, the Northern Army Group will march towards the north. That's it. And then, right there and then, he went into lunch. There was a beautiful dining room in the Bordeaux. It's quite a ridiculous memory, but I believe it's worth recalling. You see, General Gamelin had in some way excited the patriotic zeal of the cook, who had produced a lunch which was almost a wedding feast.
Et le cuisinier avait fait un déjeuner qui était à peu près l'équivalent d'un repas de noces. Et ce repas de noces...
And this incredible banquet took place in a deathly atmosphere. It was almost that. And Gamelin was swaggering and making jokes. Not particularly good ones, no, but he was talking, and that rang false, entirely false.
Et ça sonnait faux, et entièrement faux. À la fin de ce banquet...
At the end of this banquet, at the same time sad and comique, an enormous set piece arrived with angel's food cake. And I swear that this arrival seemed to me so out of place that I felt sorry the floor didn't open and swallow the table. Gamelin had a large helping of the set piece, and then we saluted him, and he left. And that was the end of his military career.
Weygand, 72 years old, replaces Gamelin. He was the head of Foch's General Staff during the First World War. Reynaud also makes Marshal Pétain Vice President of the Council. Pétain, who won the Battle of Verdun in the First World War, is already forming a separate political group. Meanwhile, Guderian pursues his race to the sea. He advances 60 miles a day. On the 19th, he is at St. Quentin. On the 20th, he takes Amiens, then Abbeville. On the evening of the 20th, the Spitta battalion of the 2nd Panzer Division is the first to reach the Channel coast. The loop is closed. The Allied Army of the North is surrounded. The Belgian Army, the British Expeditionary Corps, and 2 French armies. It's still a considerable force. Weygand himself gives the order to attack from north to south, to break out. This was Weygand's first plan. But the British don't have faith in him anymore. Lord Gort, the British Commander-in-Chief, has only one concern: to save his Expeditionary Corps. On May the 25th, the British divisions, surrounded at Arras, received the order to retreat to Dunkirk, without informing the French. As for the Belgians, they capitulated unconditionally 2 days later. King Leopold took this decision against the advice of his government and only warned the French an hour later. He refused to leave for London. For the nations, as for the men, it's a disaster. Most of the French army in the north, surrounded and in disorder, falls into German hands. Entire divisions, together with their generals. General Giraud, commander of the 9th Army, is taken prisoner. Hitler comes to visit the front, to congratulate his troops. At Ypres, where as a corporal he had fought in World War I, he gives the order for his armored divisions to halt. Will he now threaten England? Will he leave Göring's Luftwaffe to kill off the wounded enemy? Or is he still afraid of an Allied counterattack along the length of his flank? In any case, the German troops take a breather for the first time in 10 days after a 250-mile advance, while the encircled Allied armies fall back on Dunkirk. The entire British Expeditionary Force and the remains of the Army of the North are now holed up in Dunkirk, in a tight mass, hemmed in on all sides. Churchill, who has replaced Chamberlain as head of the British government, gives the order to save the British Expeditionary Corps, the only army Britain possesses. $850 boats of all kinds cross the English Channel. Fishing boats, lifeboats, coastal freighters, pleasure yachts, trawlers, tugs, and even the ceremonial barges from the Thames. Anything that can stay afloat sails for France, and soon 300 French boats join them. In the pocket of Dunkirk, 500,000 men are waiting for them. 500,000 men, exhausted, beaten, and lost, who have gathered on the beaches. 300,000 British, 200,000 French. The Luftwaffe constantly attacks the boats. More than 6,000 men died in the evacuation, burned, drowned, or choked by fuel oil from damaged and sunken ships. So, Dunkirk becomes a great battle for the French Navy, the Royal Navy, and the Royal Air Force, who throw in 150 fighter planes. They lose 106, but they account for 150 German planes. The beaches of Dunkirk, the Germans attack furiously. They realize now that the enemy is going to escape them, and 3 French divisions fight at close quarters to hold them off for nearly a week. The soldiers of the 12th, 32nd, and 68th divisions are sacrificed to protect the embarkation. In 8 days, the English and French boats evacuate 330,000 men back to England. 200,000 British soldiers have escaped from the Germans. This is a success, but it isn't victory. On the contrary, for the first time, the British realize that they themselves can be invaded. It's a shock. On June the 4th, in a great debate in the House of Commons, Churchill announces solemnly that if necessary, England will fight to the end, on the beaches, on the hills, in the fields, and in the streets. On that day, the spirit of Dunkirk is born. "130,000 French now find themselves in England. For them, the Battle of France has not ended. French boats are going to take them back to Brittany to carry on the fight. June the 4th, the Germans enter Dunkirk and discover all the equipment abandoned by the British. 2,500 heavy guns, 11,000 machine guns, and 75,000 vehicles. Off the beach lie the wrecks of 243 sunken boats, of which 9 were British destroyers and 6 French torpedo boats. "90,000 soldiers who haven't been able to embark are taken prisoner. 50,000 British and 40,000 French. Dunkirk is a bitter defeat. General Weygand has lost his battle force. To create a new army, Weygand recalls the Alpine troops from the Maginot Line and from North Africa. He hopes to constitute a new force of 60 divisions in order to counterattack. But for that, he needs time, 15 days. Meanwhile, he gives the order to hold the Somme. This is the Weygand line. For this holding mission on the Somme, he has only 7 divisions. Among them, the 4th Armoured Division under Colonel de Gaulle. De Gaulle is given the temporary rank of general. They arrive in the Abbeville sector. One of his officers, Lieutenant Cressman, remembers.
This is where General de Gaulle was. His command post, his room was here, below to the right. And when we came for liaison meetings, all that courtyard was cluttered by general staff equipment. And when we came for briefing, we came through that door and we went in to find General de Gaulle in his office there. We were in the middle of enormous confusion. Everything was upside down. We saw only men who were fleeing the scene with all their belongings, their wagons, their cows, their horses, their old carriages. And the troops were quitting too. Truly, one didn't know who would be able to hold out. Well, de Gaulle held out for a long time.
Not only does de Gaulle hold out, but he attacks as he had always advocated, with all the tanks massed like a clenched fist. He advances 15 kilometers.
This wood was taken, and then the one behind. One more victory, and we would be heading for Berlin.
And just when did you feel that things were turning out badly?
Listen, we didn't have that feeling that things were going badly. One felt that we were running out of steam. We hadn't any more tanks or equipment left, and that one couldn't advance any further because we were alone. Reinforcements were needed, but we were never desperate at any time. We took very hard blows there. Down below, there is the village of Maroy, which was retaken. We retook it, they took it back. We went back as far as the end of the village there. There were battles, but we were always winning until the moment when we were told, good, retreat, you're being relieved. And we were reunited then in a forsaken place called Roissy. And it's there de Gaulle held his first parade. It was the 2nd of June. I shall remember it all my life. It was my wedding anniversary. And it was the first time de Gaulle had been seen reviewing his troops, those that were left. Then we were a little proud. One threw one's chest out to perhaps receive medals. We were there in ranks, the last of the Mohicans, bold as brass. And he arrived, our general. He spoke to all these proud men, one after the other, and he said to each one, where is your tank? It is burnt, my general. How did it get burnt? I was hit twice by the 105s. But it should have been extinguished. I extinguished it, my general, but they hit me again. Well, it should have been salvaged a second time. I've no use for men without equipment. I'd rather have equipment without men. That was the goal.
June the 5th. Paul Reynaud gets rid of Daladier and he calls in General de Gaulle as Under-Secretary for War. He wants to stiffen his cabinet because Marshal Pétain and several other ministers are already talking about ending the war. In less than 48 hours, the Germans have overwhelmed the Maginot Line and crossed the Somme. It is a tidal wave. 95 German divisions, 10 of which are armored, fan out over France. In 2 days, Rommel conquers Normandy and takes Rouen. At the same time, von Kleist's armored divisions are approaching Paris. The Parisians, in their turn, are panic-stricken. Everything collapses. On June the 10th, the government leaves Paris. The same day, Mussolini declares war on France. A stab in the back. The French people feel abandoned. They flee, leaving everything, their houses, their towns, their villages. It is a terrible exodus, but impossible to escape attack from the plains, which spray the roads thronged with soldiers and refugees with machine gun fire. People ask, where is the French Air Force? What are they doing? The French planes are fighting, but away up there, at an altitude of 15 or 20,000 feet, where no one sees them. One of their pilots, Captain Accard, is a leading ace. He has destroyed 16 German planes. He can testify that the sky wasn't empty.
It is a reproach I have often heard, and in my hospital bed at Grange Blanche, I could see around me people who were completely surprised that an airman had been around to be shot down. For the French, everything that flew was an enemy. One of my comrades, Captain Portalis, was hit above Moselle. He came down by parachute in the middle of some French troops who shot him. He had shouted to them that he was French. They shot him, even though he had a bullet in his leg. That's how it was. Anything in the air was Canadian or German or British, never French.
Meanwhile, nearly 1,000 French fighters are making a stand against the Luftwaffe in an unequal contest. 1 against 3. 400 bombers and reconnaissance planes. Obsolete machines are massacred in the first days of the offensive. But the French fighters bring down almost 1,000 German planes. The cost is high. 700 planes lost and 200 pilots killed. Captain Akkar himself was brought down in a dogfight.
I had disengaged to come back, to take up the attack again on the German bomber formation, when I was shot between the eyes. I lost consciousness, and then I woke up without really knowing what had happened to me. I couldn't see sky or earth or my instruments. I had jumped, but with the speed that I fell, my arms twisted around, and then with difficulty, after counting up to 10, I opened my parachute. I was falling very fast and was afraid it would tear. And in the midst of this, I remembered that between 5 and 6, I was looking for the parachute cord. And the next thing I knew, I'd landed in the bushes, which had broken my fall, because the parachute had been damaged in spite of everything. The brave man who picked me up wrote later, we found the corpse of that officer in the bushes.
Did they manage to get the bullet out?
No, it's still there.
June the 11th. Complete collapse. Churchill comes to the Mouguet Chateau, close to Briare on the Loire, to meet the French government, who are moving from chateau to chateau. The atmosphere is depressed. General Weygand and Marshal Pétain paint a dark picture of the situation. The fight must be stopped, they say. That's the government's business, Paul Reynaud cuts in curtly and turns to Churchill. We haven't any more planes, he says. Send us all the RAF planes. Impossible, replies Churchill. We shall need them to defend England soon. Suggestions fall on deaf ears. Anthony Eden, then British Minister for War, is the only witness to the meeting still alive. In 1973, he was filmed by a French camera crew.
We had spoken for almost 3 hours without really getting anywhere, because we had already supplied all we had. It was explained that the British Army and the Air Force had been sent, and there was nothing more to send. And at the end, I remember, Churchill said what was going to happen if the need arose. He said, we are going to continue the war alone. You won't have any regrets, naturally, but that is what we want to do. And I remember slightly the faces of the 3 men opposite me. There was, at that moment, there were 4, because General George had arrived during the discussion. But the 3 principals were there. Reynaud, who was inscrutable. Weygand was listening politely, but I believed was unconvinced. And then Pétain, who had an incredulous expression.
During dinner, Anthony Eden received confirmation of the division between the French.
At the moment when we were going to sit down, a tall chap came in, and it was de Gaulle. And Weygand said, turning towards him, perhaps you'd like to sit next to me. Weygand was answered by de Gaulle in a dry voice, I have instructions to sit next to the British Prime Minister. I thought that Weygand was not very happy about his answer. Pétain spoke above all about the destruction of the French towns. Naturally, I was most sympathetic about that, But he insisted, I think, that it was not only Abbeville and Amiens, but that other towns had been destroyed as well. And then I said to him, well, Monsieur le Maréchal, all that's true, but there's something worse than the destruction of towns. He replied, that's typical of the English, because you've never seen anything like it in your country. I replied, well, perhaps we shall this time.
The next day, Churchill and Eden prepare to leave for London, convinced that Marshal Pétain has decided to abandon the fight.
The next morning, when we were on the steps of the house, Churchill and I, Reynaud came to speak to us about his difficulties with Pétain. At that moment, Pétain came up the steps, and Reynaud said to us, I remember it well, he's looking well this morning. There must have been disastrous news.
June the 14th, at dawn, the Germans enter Paris. Paris, an open city. Empty Paris. At the head of the column was Feldwebel Max Buschenhofen.
Our entry into Paris was on June the 14th, 1940, by the Saint-Ouen Gate. We had followed the outside roads and the Wagram Avenue as far as the Arc de Triomphe.
And what were the reactions of the Parisians?
There wasn't any. There weren't many people in the streets. There were some people who made friendly signs to us. Others turned their backs. Most of the Parisians were behind the shutters of their windows.
50 yards from here, the great French surgeon, Professor Martel, shot himself through the head. Feldwebel Max Buschenhofen still doesn't believe he's here at the foot of the Arc de Triomphe. From the top of the Eiffel Tower, they contemplate Paris at their feet. Paris under the jackboot.
Le centre d'anti-victoire.
Generaloberst von Bock und General der Artillerie von Küchler nehmen im Vorbeimarsch ihre Truppen ab.
German newsreels proudly proclaim the occupation of Paris to the German people.
Place de la Concorde. Im Hintergrund rechts das Marineministerium. Der Invalidendom, in dem Napoleon I. beigesetzt ist. Paris ist in deutscher Hand.
Yes, Paris is in the hands of the Germans. After the assault troops, smart, fresh and happy, marched down the Champs-Élysées, the SS arrived and the Gestapo, who will install themselves the next day in the Avenue Foch. The Parisians are on the roads, but they haven't gone very far. They no longer know where to go. All the bridges over the Loire are blown up. Then, hungry, bruised and desperate, they lie down in the ditches. and they watch the passage of the conquerors, these young soldiers, big and blonde with open collars, and always the noise of boots. The Gien Bridge, still in existence. A human tide of refugees crowds over, thrown into disorder by the bombings of the Stukas. On the other side, Claude Bélanger and a group of French soldiers have a tightness in their throats. They have received the order to blow up the bridge.
We began to imagine the Germans so close that it would be necessary to blow up the bridge. And it was still crowded with terrified refugees. And finally, in this frantic crowd, the extraordinary sounds and cries nearly made one forget that without further hesitation, the bridge had to be blown up. Two young girls jumped into the water in the vain hope of crossing, and they drowned one after the other. One saw women go completely mad, who wanted to destroy themselves, to commit suicide, and who even attempted to kill the people around them. There was one case of a poor woman who had a baby in her arms and who smashed her baby's head against the parapet. These were dreadful incidents which couldn't be thought about.
He will remember it all his life, that citizen of Gien, Monsieur Pilat. The Loire filled with the drifting bodies of the refugees. The Loire, last line of defense, where certain units put up a last hopeless fight. Like the officer cadets of the Cavalry College at Saumur. Officer Cadet Crestaille was one. Why did you fight here?
Because we were ordered to.
Whose order?
Colonel Michon, who was the commandant of the college, and a man who is worth describing. He made us visit, one after another, the college museum, where there was a collection of outstanding exhibits, and at the end of this visit he told us that when we received our commission from the college, we would probably be posted to some of the units given the suicide mission.
And you accepted this?
Absolutely. I know that in that generation of boys between 18 and 22, the question didn't even arise.
There are 800 Saumur cadets. They lack artillery and air cover, but they halt the German armored divisions along a 24-mile front. Francois de la Grange was also an officer cadet. Did you think you were going to die?
I don't know if one even asked that question. Yes, perhaps. Certainly. What one wanted, I believe, was above all to save one's honor.
And you don't believe that this sacrifice of the Saumur cadets was useless?
Useless? I don't know in the long run. Useless in the plan of the strategy of the war, certainly. Besides, the mayor had ordered Colonel Michon to declare Saumur an open town, saying that it was absolutely foolish to have the town shelled by German artillery, since the fight was hopeless and wouldn't, strictly speaking, serve any purpose. We had slowed down the enemy. We had slowed them down by 3 days, 4 days, with practically no proper equipment. That is perhaps an exploit on the technical level, if I dare say so. But in all ways, I believe that the sacrifice of my comrades who died was not useless, simply because we had certain beliefs about France. And I think that those who survived this battle, and their children, will have in the end preserved this ideal of France.
The French army is no more. 1,450,000 men have been taken prisoner. 100,000 have been killed, 250,000 wounded. Yes, the French are beaten. In 1 month, they have lost relatively more men than in the worst moments of the First World War. They deserve better than that. In Bordeaux, the French government, the deputies and the ministers camp in the town hall, in the police station, in the hotel. In the port, the steamer Massilia is standing by, ready to carry them to North Africa if necessary. But for 4 days, 2 factions stand against each other. Pétain and Weygand, with Laval in the shadows, demand an armistice. Reynaud, Mandel and de Gaulle want France to carry on the fight in North Africa alongside the British. On June the 15th, there is a dramatic meeting of the Council of Ministers. Monsieur Pierre de Lys, Weygand's aide-de-camp, was there.
Monsieur Paul Reynaud proposed to General Weygand that he should capitulate. And General Weygand, I still remember, was violently angry and sweating. He was beside himself, saying, "What? You are asking me to capitulate? I will never capitulate. The capitulation of an army at war is a disgrace to that army." In the eyes of a soldier, there is an essential difference, I believe, between the capitulation of an army that has been beaten and one which is still armed. That is to say, if there are no more arms, the enemy comes in, invading the land, and there is nothing more opposing him. In an armistice, it is the government who takes the responsibility, not to disarm, but to cease hostilities on certain conditions.
The next day, Reynaud gives way and resigns. De Gaulle leaves for London. Pétain becomes the head of government.
Frenchmen, I make the gift of myself to France to mitigate her misfortune. It is with a broken heart that I tell you today that the fight must cease.
Hitler dictates his conditions. The armistice will be signed at Bretonde in the Compiègne forest, where that other armistice had been signed on November the 11th, 1918. At 3:15, Hitler arrives, accompanied by Marshal Göring, Grand Admiral Roeder, General Keitel, Ribbentrop, Hess, and Himmler. They are all there. There's the historic carriage, Fox carriage. At 3:30, the French parliamentarians arrive. General Hunziger, Air Marshal Bergeret, Admiral Laluc, and the ambassador Léon Noël. They have come from Paris and are surprised. The Germans hadn't told them where they were being taken. Immediately, without saying a word, Hitler signals to General Keitel, who reads a preliminary declaration. The French delegation has been brought here to wipe out the humiliation of the Treaty of Versailles and to make good the injustice done to the German people. At 3:40 in the afternoon, Hitler sets out the text of the conditions of the armistice to the French. Then he gets up and goes. He hasn't said a word. In fact, he is very pleased to declare an armistice with France. 2 days earlier, he had explained to Mussolini, who would have preferred to deal with a legal French government, that it would be easier to carry out German decisions through the French civil service. Although Hitler appears to be conciliatory, it's only to further his own interests. France is divided into 2 zones, an occupied zone in the north and a free zone in the south. Hitler doesn't take over the French fleet. He simply requires that it is disarmed in French ports. At 5:45, the French realize the full extent of Hitler's dictatorship. One clause is unacceptable. Hitler requires France to send him the German citizens who took refuge in France, the Jews and the anti-Nazis. From the tents set up for them, the French delegates telephone Bordeaux. Then they argue with the Germans for 24 hours. The next day, General Keitel gives them an ultimatum. You have 1 hour to sign. Pétain's government backs down. On June the 22nd at 6:50 p.m., the armistice is signed. The German refugees are betrayed to Hitler. In London, General de Gaulle says no to the armistice, no to defeat. No, France hasn't lost the war. She has only lost a battle.
The French defeat was due to the mechanized air and ground forces of the enemy. We believe that for the honor of France, we must continue to make war alongside our allies. A superior mechanized force will allow us to achieve victory and to deliver our country.
Et de délivrer la patrie.
Paris, June the 23rd. All night, the French prisoners of war have been working to remove the sandbags which cover the monuments of the capital. At 6 o'clock in the morning, Paris receives a distinguished tourist, Adolf Hitler. Paris is occupied. But this isn't the end of the tragic story. All is ready for the second act. The collaborators, the Gestapo, the hunger and the misery. Also the resistance, torture. Europe is all set for 4 years of anguish.
The battle you have just seen was one of the decisive battles of the Second World War, a war that affected the destinies of men and nations the world over. The film you have just witnessed was discovered in film libraries all over the world and painstakingly edited to show you the incredible impact these individual battles had on the outcome of this most devastating of wars. The world, thanks to these films, will never forget the tremendous effort put forth by all people included in the big battles.